Shavua Tov and Good Chodesh, or Chodesh Tov. It is the new month of Kislev, a wonderful month, the month of Hanukkah, the month of miracles. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night as we start the week off with some beautiful learning? Joe in the Inland Empire, Nancy, North Carolina, Stephen in Dover, New Hampshire, enjoying your new book. I just received it on Friday. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're enjoying it, Stephen. That's the book. Let My People Laugh. Greatest Jewish jokes of all time. Bestseller. Multiple categories on Amazon. Just search for Salvador Litvak on Amazon or wherever you buy fine books. Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Shandora in the Bronx, Jonathan in Southern California, Frank in San Pedro, Marjorie in Georgia, Alan in New York City, Ella in Southern California. Let's do it. Our daf tonight is page 157 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, continuing our journey through chapter 9 tonight. Opening Mishna number 10 and 11. Rabbi Eliezer said, this is Mishna number 10. It's at the bottom of page 156b. Rabbi Eliezer says, on Shabbos, the verbal statement of a person on his deathbed, giving away his property, stands. Right? So he can do this without a written deed. He just does it with oral instruction. Now, why is that? Is it because he's on his deathbed? Or is it and? In other words, what is the reasoning? He's on his deathbed. Right? So we've already seen that we relax all kinds of requirements when a person is trying to give away property while on his deathbed. A, because we want to follow his wishes. And B, because we don't want to aggravate him, which might shorten his life. But also on Shabbos, when writing is prohibited, and even by rabbinic law, it's prohibited to perform an act of acquisition, even if the act itself wouldn't violate Shabbos. I mean, for example, in my house, I can pick up a chair. On Shabbos, I can move a chair around. I can move furniture around so that I can sit on it on Shabbos. But we can't make a deal for me to sell this chair to you, and then you pick up the chair as a kinyan, right? That's pulling. That would be a formal act of acquisition, which would seal the deal, as it were. Well, that's something, that kind of commercial transaction that is prohibited on Shabbos. So, in light of that, let's read this carefully because I find this Mishnah very confusing. Let's see if we can keep it straight. Rabbi Eliezer says, on Shabbos, the verbal statement of a person on his deathbed stands as he cannot write, and the sages instituted that he can effect the transaction verbally, lest the inability to do so exacerbate his condition. But a verbal instruction does not stand if stated on a weekday, because on a weekday he could write. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, even though he's on his deathbed, if he makes the instruction orally, and we're talking about giving away some of his property, not all of it, because all of it is a different case when oral certainly works, but where he's giving away some of his property, which means that even if he recovers, he can't get it back. Rabbi Eliezer says, well, on a weekday, he can give that instruction, but he has to write it down because it's permitted to write, and because this is a permanent gift, even if he recovers. Rabbi Yehoshua says, with regard to Shabbos, the sages stated that his verbal instruction is sufficient, even though writing is prohibited. Therefore, one can infer, kal v'chomer, that the same applies with regard to a weekday when writing is permitted. Right? So according to Rabbi Yehoshua, and we follow Rabbi Yehoshua, he doesn't need to have this in writing on Shabbos. Now, what we might say is, well, on Shabbos, he couldn't do it in writing anyway. So what about on a weekday? So on a weekday, even without writing, it's still permitted. In other words, even without writing, the gift stands, even on a weekday. Similarly, one can acquire property on behalf of a minor, but one cannot acquire property on behalf of an adult, since he could perform his own kinyan, his own act of acquisition. This is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yehoshua says, and we follow Rabbi Yehoshua, the sages stated this halakha with regard to a minor that you can acquire on his behalf, and one may infer, kal v'chomer, that this also applies with regard to an adult who is able to perform the acquisition himself, right? So here, it's the logic of it. You can acquire on behalf of a minor, right? Because he can't do the acquisition himself, and maybe it's advantageous to him. Let's say you're his guardian and he's an orphan, and this is an opportunity for him to acquire something that'll be good for him. So he can't acquire it himself because a minor can't acquire property, can't do a kinyan because he's a minor, but you could do it for him. An adult can do it as his agent. But you can't do that on behalf of an adult because the adult could do it himself. Rabbi Yehoshua says if you can acquire property on behalf of a minor who can acquire for himself, all the more so you can acquire on behalf of an adult who can acquire for himself. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now we have a short Gemara, and let's see if the Gemara is going to help us understand it better or if it's going to further confuse. The Gemara asks, whose opinion is expressed in the Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, well, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Who brought Yehuda into this? I thought we were talking about Eliezer versus Yehoshua. Let's keep reading. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. How do we know that? This is as it is taught in a baraisa. Rabbi Meir says that Rabbi Eliezer says, with regard to a person on his deathbed who distributes his property by verbal instruction on a weekday, his statement stands because he can write. But his statement does not stand on Shabbos because he cannot write. So this seems to indicate that, well, we're not going to force the writing because he's on his deathbed, and we want to make sure that he is comfortable that his instruction is being followed, even if paper and pen and witnesses are not available. So the verbal instruction will stand on a weekday because we don't need the writing, simply because he's on his deathbed, but it takes the place of a proper writing. And since it's taking the place of a proper writing, and a proper writing is permitted on a weekday, then this would be permitted on a weekday. But on Shabbos, when writing is not permitted, we're not going to allow the instruction at all? Is that what he's saying? Rabbi Meir says, Rabbi Eliezer says, with regard to a person on his deathbed who distributes his property by verbal instruction, on a weekday it's good. The verbal instruction is good because it should have had a writing. It doesn't have a writing because he's on his deathbed, but it could have had a writing, and therefore the instruction stands. But his instruction doesn't stand on Shabbos because to give this kind of a gift, it should have had a writing. Because he's on his deathbed, maybe we don't need the writing, but since writing is prohibited anyway on Shabbos, we don't allow this gift to stand. Remember, a permanent gift, even if he recovers. That's Rabbi Meir in the name of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yehoshua says, with regard to weekdays, and now we're at the page 157a. With regard to weekdays, the sages stated that the verbal instruction of a person on his deathbed is valid, even though it is permitted to write. Right? So even though it is permitted to write, we're going to allow it without the writing because he's on his deathbed. And one may infer kal v'chomer, all the more so, that the same applies with regard to Shabbos when writing is prohibited. Still, it's going to stand because we don't need the writing. We don't need the writing because he's on his deathbed. So what difference does it make if it's Shabbos when writing would be prohibited or when kinyans are prohibited? We're allowing it because he's on his deathbed and we don't want to aggravate him. And we already know that for the sake of saving life, we override the restrictions of Shabbos. So all the more so, we're going to allow this verbal instruction to stand and not aggravate him since he's on his deathbed. That might actually shorten his life. And Rabbi Yehuda, now, right, that was Rabbi Yehoshua who I was just reading to you, who's mentioned in our Mishnah. But the Gemara comes to say that our Mishnah, which is in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua, is actually squaring with Rabbi Yehuda. What does Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda says that Rabbi Eliezer says, so Rabbi Yehuda is bringing in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, on Shabbos, the verbal statement of a person on his deathbed stands due to the fact that he cannot write. But a verbal instruction does not stand on a weekday. Yep, that sounds like our Mishnah. And I guess Rabbi Yehuda is now going to bring down what Rabbi Yehoshua said. Rabbi Yehoshua says, with regard to Shabbos, the sages stated that his verbal instruction stands even though writing is prohibited, and therefore, kal v'chomer, the same applies all the more so on a weekday when writing is permitted. And similarly, one can acquire property on behalf of a minor, but one cannot acquire property on behalf of an adult, since he can effect the acquisition himself. This is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yehoshua says the sages stated this law with regard to a minor that you can acquire on his behalf, even though he himself cannot acquire. All the more so, we can acquire on behalf of an adult who himself could acquire. Okay, so it's like, when can we use that kal v'chomer? When do we use the language of even though? Still we will, etc. And that's actually the end of the Gemara on Mishnah number 10. So hopefully that made sense. God forbid you're ever in a situation where a person on his deathbed and is giving oral instructions. If you can't get a rabbi on the phone to make sure you're getting it right, just make sure that it is as clear as possible. And if it's not Shabbos and you can write it down and read to him, is this what you meant? Yeah? You sure we're clear? Yeah? Great. Maybe even have him sign it. But if that's going to aggravate him, don't aggravate him. Okay? So here we go. Mishnah number 11 here in chapter 9. And we've talked about this a little bit before. Now we're going to get a little more detailed on the house that collapsed on a person and that person's heir. Why does it matter that the house collapsed? Because we do not know who died first. And it makes a difference if, for example, in our Mishnah, a father and son are in a house and it collapsed and they both died, but we don't know who died first. So what we don't know is if the father died first, the son in that moment inherited the property. And so then when he died, he was holding property that previously belonged to the father. And if the son has creditors, that property can be used to pay the son's creditors. But if the son died first, then he never inherited from the father. And so the creditors of the son cannot look to whatever the estate the father left behind, because now that the son died first, the father's estate goes to other heirs. And they're not responsible to pay the debts of the son who died first. So that's why this whole hypothetical situation is very important. Okay, Mishnah number 11. A house collapsed on a son and upon his father, or upon a certain person and upon those from whom he stands to inherit. And it is unknown who died first. If the son bore the responsibility to pay the marriage contract of his wife, meaning because he died, so his wife receives his ketubah payment as a widow. So he had a responsibility to pay the marriage contract of his wife and to pay a creditor. So he had outstanding debts to pay to a creditor. And the son has no other money with which to pay the ketubah of his wife and the loan to that creditor, except that which he might inherit from his father. Well, the father's heirs say the son died first, and afterward the father died. And therefore the son never inherited property from his father. And therefore the money from the father goes to the other heirs, and the creditor and the widow get nothing. And the creditors say, right, meaning the widow of the son and his creditors, they say, well, the father died first, and afterward the son died, resulting in the sons inheriting the father's property, enabling the creditors to collect payment from the property even after the son's death. Well, since we don't know who died first and there's these competing claims, there is a dispute with regard to how to rule in this situation. Since it cannot be determined who died first, Beis Shammai, the school of Shammai, say they divide the property between them so that the father's heirs receive half of his property and the son's creditors receive the other half. And Beis Hillel say the property retains its previous ownership status. Since the last known owner of the property was the father, the property is now given to the father's heirs. We can't assume that the son inherited. We have no reason to believe that. We have no reason to be certain that they did. And therefore, the widow and the creditors of the son's loan, they are out of luck. That is the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. And by the way, we follow Beis Hillel. The Gemara. We learned in a Mishnah elsewhere on page 175a of this tractate, one who lends money to another with a promissory note can collect the debt even from liened property that has been sold. In other words, I lend you $1,000 and you give me a promissory note. And in the promissory note, it says that if you don't pay me back the $1,000, I can seize your car. Before you pay me back, what happens if you sell the car? Well, I have a lien on that car. So even though you sell the car, if you don't pay me back the $1,000 that you owe me, I can go seize that car. The guy you sold the car to will be angry, but he has no argument against me because I had a lien on that car. He's going to go back to you and get his money back for the car that he bought from you and then was repossessed by your creditor. I can only do that because the loan is evidenced by a promissory note. By contrast, if one lends money only with witnesses, meaning there were witnesses to the loan, but no promissory note was drafted, which is evidence of the lien on certain property, then the creditor can collect the debt only from unsold property, right? If I lend you $1,000 in front of witnesses, and then you haven't paid me back, now I can go seize property, but only if it's in your possession. So if you still have that car, I can seize it to pay the loan that you owe me. But if you sold that car, I can't go chase down that car. It's sold, right? So the buyer has bought it. It's only when there is a promissory note that I can seize a car after you seize your car after you sold it. Why are we talking about this? We will see. Shmuel raises a dilemma. If the borrower wrote in the promissory note, the property that I will acquire in the future shall be liened to this debt. Okay, I lend you $1,000 with a promissory note, and you don't have any property. But the promissory note says that if you acquire property after this date, it will serve as a lien for the loan. So you didn't own a car when I lent you the $1,000. But then maybe you used $1,000 to buy the car. And then the car, according to this promissory note, since you acquired it afterward, now becomes, I get a lien on that car. It becomes the collateral, even though you didn't own it at the time that I lent you the money. So what happens then? The property, right, the borrower wrote in the promissory note, the property that I will acquire in the future shall be liened to this debt. And he subsequently acquired property. What is the law? Is the property liened or not? And the Gemara clarifies the dilemma. According to the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says a person can transfer ownership of an entity that has not yet come into the world, you should not raise the dilemma, as the lender certainly acquires, i.e. places a lien on the property. So according to Rabbi Meir, yes, I can lend you money with a promissory note that says property you'll acquire later, even though you don't own it now, but anything you'll acquire later will serve as collateral for this loan. I'll have a lien on it. It works, according to Rabbi Meir. But Rabbi Meir is the minority opinion. So let's keep reading. Rather, when you raise the dilemma, raise it according to the opinion of the rabbis, who say, A person cannot transfer ownership of an entity that has not yet come into the world, right? Can you sell me the eggs that your chicken will lay tomorrow? No, right? No, because they don't exist yet. You can sell me the right to come and collect eggs that may be laid in the future in your barn by these chickens. That you can do. But can you sell the specific egg that your chicken is going to lay tomorrow? No, because it doesn't exist yet. Rav Yosef said, so what about that? So is it the same to say you can't sell me something that does not yet exist, but can you offer me as collateral property that you have not yet acquired? Sounds like maybe probably not. Rav Yosef said, come in here a proof from a Mishna, Tractate Kesuvos 110a. If one produces a promissory note against another and the borrower produced a bill of sale dated after the promissory note that states that the lender sold him a field of his, so Admon says that the borrower can say, were I really indebted to you, you should have collected the loan when you sold me the field. And the rabbis say this does not prove anything. It is possible that this lender was smart, was perspicacious, as he sold the borrower the land for a good reason, because now he can take the field as collateral from him in lieu of the outstanding loan. And this Mishnah indicates that even property acquired by the borrower after the promissory note is written is lien. This would indicate that you can create a lien on property that the borrower does not yet have in his possession, does not yet own. Sounds like you can write a promissory note that will create a lien on property that he acquires later. Rava said to Rav Yosef, do you speak of a case where the debt is collected from the debtor? With regard to collecting the debt from him, the debt is collected from any property currently in his possession, even from the cloak that is upon his shoulders. You don't even need a promissory note for that. When the dilemma was raised to us, it was with regard to a case where the borrower wrote, the property that I will acquire shall be liened. And he subsequently acquired property, and then he sold it to someone else. So the dilemma also pertains to a case where the borrower wrote, the property that I will acquire shall be liened, and he subsequently acquired property, and then he bequeathed it to his heirs. He died and bequeathed it to his heirs. In these cases, what is the law? Does that lien take hold on property that he acquired after the date of the promissory note, but he wrote in the promissory note that he would give a lien on property that he acquired later, and then he acquired that property, and then he sold it? So can the creditor now go seize that property from the buyer of the borrower who acquired property and sold it to the buyer? Rav Chana said, come and hear a proof from the Mishnah. In a case where the house collapsed on a son and upon his father, or upon a certain person and those who stand to inherit from him, and it is unknown who died first, the law depends on the circumstances. If the son bore the responsibility to pay the marriage contract of his wife and to pay a creditor, and the son had no money with which to pay them except for that which he might inherit from his father, and the father's heirs say the son died first and afterward the father died, and therefore the son did not inherit property from the father, but the creditors say the father died first and afterward the son died, and therefore the son inherited the property and the creditors can go after it. Well, there is a dispute with regard to how to rule. So in this case, the creditors claim that the son inherited his father's property, and therefore they have a lien upon the property. So what does that mean? If you say that they have a lien on property that the son did not own at the time the loan was made, obviously the son didn't own it then, because we're saying he only inherited it when his father died. So if we're saying that the creditors are claiming that they have a lien on property that the son inherited from his father, it must mean that we are able to create a lien on property that is acquired by the borrower after the date of making the promissory note, and that we're going to be able to go after it. The Gemara explains, and if it enters your mind, wait a second. Yeah. And if it enters your mind to say that when the borrower writes, the property that I will acquire shall be liened, and he acquires property and sells it to others, that it is not liened, and that when he writes the property that I shall acquire shall be liened, and he acquires property and bequeaths it to his heirs, it is not liened, well then our Mishnah would not make sense. Although the father indeed died first, this case is comparable to one where the borrower writes, the property that I shall acquire shall be liened, as the son acquired the property after receiving the loan. And this indicates that a lien can be placed on property that one will acquire in the future. So Rav Nachman said to the sages, Rabbi Zera, our colleague, interpreted the Mishnah as follows. In this case, the creditors do not claim the property because of a lien. That's not the basis of their claim. Not because they had a promissory note and a lien on property that the son would acquire later. That is not their argument. Rather, they claim the money because it is a mitzvah incumbent upon the orphans to repay their father's debt. To pay. Oh, okay. So what they're saying is that the son in the house probably left sons, right? So in other words, he inherited from the father since they both died in the house. And then if it's his property, who does it go to? His heirs, right? His heirs. So now those heirs, who weren't in the collapsing house, they can pay the debt. Why? Not because there's a lien on it, but because there's a mitzvah to pay the debts of the father. Rav Ashi objects to this. If the promissory note does not place a lien on the property, this is considered a loan by oral agreement. And Rav and Shmuel both say a loan by oral agreement cannot be collected, neither from the heirs nor from the buyers. There is no mitzvah to pay the debts of the father if the debts of the father were merely oral loans. Now we're on page 157b. Rather, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah? This Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Oh, the minority opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says a person can transfer ownership of an entity that has not yet come into the world. Similarly, Rabbi Meir maintains that one can place a lien on property that the borrower will subsequently acquire, and therefore, if they had a promissory note for this debt, and the widow certainly has a written instrument, the ketubah, therefore, they can exercise that lien on property that the son didn't own when the loan was made or when the ketubah was written, but which he acquired when his father died first in the collapsing house, and then he acquired that property, and now they have a lien on it. So that's according to Rabbi Meir. But Rabbi Meir is the minority opinion. Rav Yaakov from Nehar Pekod says in the name of Ravina, come and hear proof from a Mishnah, Tractate Shavias 10.5. Promissory notes that are antedated, i.e., that are dated prior to the date on which the loan was given, are invalid, right? So the point is, when you write a promissory note, what you're saying is, I am hereby borrowing $1,000 from you, and I'm giving you this promissory note so that you can seize the following property from me if I don't pay it. That's a promissory note. If I say, this promissory note gives you the right to seize property from me to pay back the loan that you are going to give me next year. Oh, now that is not valid. I can't write a promissory note today for money that hasn't even been loaned. Because who knows if you're ever going to lend it to me. And are you going to acquire a lien, a collateral interest in my property? What if we write this promissory note, you never lend me money, but then let's say I have some property, I have a field, and I sell it to someone else. You never even lent me the money, but you have the promissory note. And now you could go seize that field from someone else? In fact, you and I could make some kind of an arrangement like this, and you could use it so that you and I could commit a fraud together, and you go seize that field from that other guy. right? And now he has to come to me to get his money back from the field that I sold to him. And maybe I've disappeared, maybe it's a problem. So that they said no antedated promissory notes. You can only issue a promissory note when the loan has flowed. So then what happens? This is because the promissory note places a lien on the borrower's property. By dating the document earlier than the loan itself, the lender appears to have a lien on property that the borrower sold prior to taking out the loan, and this enables the lender to fraudulently repossess it from a buyer. But promissory notes that are post-dated are valid, as this does not enable the lender to defraud a buyer. So apparently, you can lend me $1,000 and you didn't get a promissory note. But, we're good friends, and you come to me a week later and you say, Sal, I really should have got a promissory note from you. Give me the promissory note now. And I agree, and I give it to you. That's a post-dated promissory note, and that is valid. Now, the Gemara explains, and if it enters your mind to say that property that the borrower acquires after receiving the loan is not liened, even when he writes the property that I will acquire shall be liened, and he acquires property and sells it to others, or when he writes the property that I will acquire shall be liened, and he acquires property and then he bequeaths it to his heirs, why then, if you say that you can't do that, well then why would post-dated promissory notes be valid? They should not be valid, as in some instances they enable the creditor to fraudulently repossess property that is not liened. For example, if the borrower acquires property after receiving the loan, but before the date on the promissory note, and he sells it after that date. This case is comparable to one where the borrower writes the property that I will acquire shall be liened. So the Gemara answers, in accordance with whose opinion is the Mishna? This Mishna is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says a person can acquire ownership or can transfer ownership of an entity that has not yet come into the world. Rav Misharshia says in the name of Rava, come in here a proof from a Baraisa. Let's look at a different law that may shed light on what's going on. In this Baraisa, Baraisas are laws that were contemporaneous with the Mishnah, not quite as authoritative, but they get used all the time here in the Gemara. With regard to collecting a debt, in a case of enhancement of land, how does it happen that the debt cannot be collected from liened property that has been sold? Well, let's unpack that. So I'm going to collect a debt, right? And what we're saying is, let's say you lent me $1,000. I gave you a promissory note that you can seize my field if I don't pay you the $1,000. Okay, I don't pay the $1,000, and in the meantime, I sold that field to Reuven next door. So, do you have a right to seize the field? Sure, because you had a promissory note that was properly dated. You had a lien in that field, and then when I sold it, the buyer was taking the risk, if he didn't do his due diligence, that there might be a promissory note out there with a lien on that field. So, you can seize that field. Now, and then the buyer comes to me to get his money back. But what's an interesting thing here is, well, what if the field was worth $1,000 when you and I, when I borrowed the $1,000 and gave you the promissory note, and the field was a good collateral for it because it was worth $1,000. But meanwhile, after I sold it to Reuven next door, he made improvements. And now the field is actually, its drainage has been added to it. It's been zoned so that you can grow a rare crop on it. And now it's not worth $1,000. Now it's worth $5,000. So now you just seized a field to pay off a $1,000 loan that actually is worth $5,000. Do you get to keep all that $5,000? Who gets the excess? Does it go to me? Does it go to him? What happens to it? So let's keep reading. Okay. So come in here from a proof from a Baraisa. With regard to collecting a debt, in a case of enhancement of land, how does it happen that the debt cannot be collected from lien property that has been sold? This question arises in a case where a debtor sold a field to another and the buyer enhanced it. Reuven enhanced it. And a creditor came and repossessed it from the buyer. When the buyer collects the value of the land from the seller, he comes to me, right? He collects the value of the land from the seller. He collects the principal even from liened property that was sold to others. but he collects the value of the enhancement only from unsold property. Interesting. He and I had no loan agreement. I sold him that field for $1,000. He improved it, and then it was seized by my creditor. So now he comes to me. What does he want? He paid $1,000 for the field, but he invested another $4,000 into it. So now it's $5,000 that he's out when that field was seized. What can he demand of me? He can demand the $5,000. I say, I don't have any money. But if I have property, he can seize my property to get paid back for the field that was seized from him that he purchased from me. And with regard to the principal, even if I had a field that I sold, another field that I sold to someone else, he can seize that field. We didn't have a promissory note and a lien on my other fields, but because I used a field that I sold to him, as collateral, and there was a lien on it, we see here that he gets automatically a lien on my other field with respect to the principal that he paid for it. But with respect to the enhancements, the money he invested in it, making it more valuable, for that, he can't go seize my other property that I've sold to someone else. For that, he can only seize it from property that I currently possess, that not stuff I've sold. Right, so when the buyer collects the value of the land from the seller, when Reuven comes to me, he collects the principal, the $1,000 that he paid for that field, even from lien property that was sold to others, but he collects the value of the enhancement only from unsold property. And if it enters your mind to say that the property that the borrower acquires, I was the borrower, that the borrower acquires after receiving the loan is not liened, even when he writes the property that I will acquire shall be liened, and he acquires property and sells it to others, or when he writes the property that I will acquire shall be liened, and he acquires property after that, and he bequeaths it to his heirs, why does the creditor collect his debt by repossessing the enhancement from the buyer? Since the enhancement was not extant at the time of the loan, it is not liened. And the Gemara answers, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishna? This Mishna is in accordance with Rabbi Meir, who says a person can transfer ownership of an entity that has not yet come into the world. So the dilemma of Shmuel is raised according to the opinion of the rabbis, not according to Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara comments, if you say that when the borrower writes, the property that I will acquire shall be liened, and then he acquires property and he sells it, and you say that it is not liened, and that when he writes the property that I shall acquire shall be liened, and then he acquires property and bequeaths it to his heirs, and you say it is not liened, then it is not liened. And the following question will not arise. If you say that it is liened, what is the law with regard to one who borrowed money from the lender and then borrowed money from another lender, stating in both cases that the property that he shall acquire shall be liened, and he then acquired land? Does the first lender have a lien upon the property, or does the last lender have a lien upon the property? Right? If I had two creditors, I borrowed money from two guys, and to both of them I said, I don't have any property now, but anything I acquire in the future, you'll have a lien on that. And then I acquire, let's say a field that is of a value that could satisfy only one of these debts. So who has a lien on it? The guy that I gave this future lien, that I gave it to him first, or the guy that I gave it to second? Is it the first one acquires this future lien on property that I'll acquire later, or is it the last one, the most recent one, who has such a lien? Rav Nachman said, this matter was raised before us, and the sages sent a response from there, meaning from Eretz Yisrael, to the Jewish community in Bavel. The first lender acquires the property, since his lien came first. And Rav Huna says the lenders divide the property between them. And so teaches Rabba Bar Abba, the lenders divide the property between them. And Ravina said the first time Rav Ashi taught this matter, he said to us, the first lender acquires the property. And the last time Rav Ashi taught us this matter, he said to us, the lenders divide the property between them. And the law is that they divide the property between them. So now we don't need to get into the nuances of whether they divide or the first one gets. The point is that they got the interest. The Gemara raised an objection from that baraisa. So with regard to collecting a debt in the case of enhancement of land, how does it occur that the debt cannot be collected from lien property that has been sold? So this question arises in a case where one sold a field to another and the buyer enhanced it. and a creditor came and repossessed it from the buyer. When the buyer collects the value of the land from the seller, he collects the principal, even from liened property that has been sold to others, but he collects the value of the enhancement only from unsold properties that's still in the possession of the one who borrowed money and gave a lien on that field that he sold to the buyer, and the buyer then enhanced it. And if it is so that in general the property is divided between the creditors, then since both the creditor and the buyer have a lien on the enhancement of the property, the buyer should collect only half of the value of the enhancement. And the Gemara, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned, I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara answers, what does the Baraisa mean as well when it teaches us that the buyer collects the enhancement? The Baraisa means that he collects half of the value of the enhancement. He is going to be standing alongside other creditors of this guy who borrowed money all over town and doesn't have what to pay for. This guy who bought and enhanced, and then the field was seized from him. He's going to become one of the creditors, and there's going to be other creditors, but they're all going to acquire an interest in the unsold properties. And so that would seem to indicate that you can acquire a lien when there's a promissory note that says any property I'll acquire later, you can have a lien on it. And we seem to be saying that that's related to our Mishnah, which is about the collapsing house. And if the father died first, that the son acquired property, and that therefore the widow can collect from it, but that's not where the law came out. This was definitely very complex commercial law. And please do not be discouraged if you're having trouble following it, because it's tough to follow. Okay, Bill. Prayers appreciated. This time last night, I filed my PhD application for the theology department at Vanderbilt, my first choice school. It's in God's hands now. Bill, may you be blessed to end up learning exactly where you belong. And if Vanderbilt is exactly where you belong in God's eyes, then so may you have it and rejoice in it. Say amen. Bill, making sure I remembered right, selling the right to collect future produce remains distinct from selling future produce. Wait a minute. Selling the right to collect future produce remains distinct from selling future produce even if it's time-bound, i.e., you cannot sell tomorrow's eggs, but you can sell the right to collect eggs only for tomorrow. That's how I remember it. And I'm not a poskening rabbi, but I think we've got it right. Sharon, how far back does ownership rights of creditors go? If I have a lien on your car and then you sell it and the new owner sells it again, does the creditor still have the right to acquire that car? That is a great question. It's a very simple, fundamental question. And I don't know the answer. That's such a good question. It would seem like, well, if the creditor can chase down this property that he has a lien on it, even after the borrower sells it, then doesn't his lien stay on that property, even if the buyer then sells it to a new buyer? Like in our world, that would totally make sense. I mean, I remember when I was, for the short time that I was a lawyer, I was working at a big firm, Skadden Arps in New York City, and I got involved somehow in aircraft financing agreements. And it's kind of interesting that when an airline buys an airplane, they borrow money from a bank, and they, same way like we pay off a car, they pay off the plane, but the engines have their own financing agreements. And the due diligence on this massive stack of documents to establish, that deal for the plane and for each of the engines was very much tied to that specific engine, right? With all its identifying, numbers, right? There's all kinds of numbers that identify a particular aircraft engine. And then you have this like UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, lien on that engine until the loan is paid off. And presumably, if you were buying, if one airline was buying a used engine from another airline, they would need to do their due diligence and make sure that, that first airline had paid off its loans. Otherwise, they were now entering into an arrangement not only with that airline, but with its creditor, right? With its bank that lent it money. And you have to do that due diligence. And it's doable because these kinds of things are filed, in major databases, and you can know exactly who has a lien on what. But in the ancient world, much more confusing. Who knows who has a lien? How can you tell? Something's been bought and sold a few times. Does a lien still exist on it? So I'm not sure. I'm not sure how many times, how many iterations of purchase and sale a creditor can chase down that property. Maybe as many times as been bought and sold. If the original borrower doesn't pay the loan, this guy can seize it, but I'm not sure. Karen, in ancient times, was there some way to do title search for possible liens on hand? I don't think so, right? I mean, that's so much less documentation. It was like such a big deal just to hire a scribe to actually write a marriage contract. It was like a big deal and expensive. There was not anything like the proliferation of documents and document filing systems that we have in modern times. So, obviously it was much less than now. Was there some method to do the title search? I just don't know offhand. I'd like to know more about that. I think it's interesting. Sharon, what if the property has a lien and is sold, and after sold it was discovered it has gold or oil reserves, and the owner didn't enhance the land, but its value has significantly increased? Yes, there was a note about that. I saw that. Is that tomorrow's Mishna? No. That's not tomorrow. I saw a note about that. If the enhancement was not due to the labor of the buyer, but it just happened, right? Consider a case where if the property was enhanced due to the buyer's investment in the property, then the buyer's expenses are deducted before calculating the half of the value of the enhancement that the lender can repossess. The REMA adds that some authorities say that even if the buyer invested in the property, the lender does not deduct the expenses. The buyer can collects only from the lender. I'm not seeing a note about that here. I thought I had seen it. But it's a great question, right? If the land just becomes valuable, or if it turns out to be valuable, right? Let's say an asteroid lands there that's made out of gold. So that happened after. Or it turns out the gold was always there, but no one knew. And I don't know if those are two different cases or not. But then what? Certainly the seller would like to retract the sale, but maybe he can't do that. He didn't know? Too bad. You're out of luck. But interesting that the lender still has this collateral interest on it, so he can seize it. But can he seize all of that value? Why should he be able to do that? The new owner of the field should be able to say, okay, that guy owes you $1,000. Here's your $1,000. You've been satisfied. You don't get this majorly valuable field from me. That would be my common sense approach. But I don't know enough about it. And we really were talking more about the specific question of the house collapsing, right? And what do we do since we don't know who died first? And then we started looking at this other area of law, which led to the question of acquiring a lien on something that the guy doesn't possess yet and whether it can be seized or not. But we haven't really explored this area of the law. We'll talk more about it in later pages in this tractate. Karen, was there any form of title insurance? I don't know. And Karen, would it not be fraudulent to use the same property twice as a lien without telling the second creditor? I would think yes, but so the borrower is the one who committed the fraud. So both creditors certainly have an action against him, but that guy disappears or he dies, and now his heirs have the land or he sold it. So what are the creditors going to do? Yeah, that guy shouldn't have done that, but he did, and now the creditors are coming and expecting to be paid because they didn't know they were being defrauded. Very tough situation. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have